Morning, comrades. All right, sorry, we're a little bit late getting started today. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Calvin. Yeah, is it good? Okay. Lots of technical things. So I just wanted to go over the program quickly because we have some changes today. I just want to say again, last night, it was such a great discussion that we ended on with a lot of very thoughtful comments, and we're looking forward to taking some of those conversations and debates into today's program. So looking forward to that. I wanted to just go over some of the changes. So in terms of the program itself, we are combining, okay, sorry. If you look to the second half of the day on the program, session 7 and session 8, we are actually changing session 8 because Dr. Natasha Ramanu, who is going to give the presentation on climate change, she is unable to make it today because of a emergency scheduling issue with her work. And so what we've decided to do instead is to combine session 7 and session 8. And you will be receiving this draft of an open letter to the World Bank later today. We will both email it to you, but we will also have hard copies, and we'll have an opportunity to have a short presentation on it first and then get a chance to read it together. So there's no one has to try to find a few minutes here and there to try to read during the day. We'll try to do, we'll set aside some time to do that together. And then the respondents who are going to be speaking in session 8 will be giving responses to the open letter. Oh, sorry. And I should also say that the open letter, we'll have a presentation on it. We'll have a chance to read it, and then we'll break into small groups and get a chance to have some more discussion on it within our small groups. And then we'll hear from the respondents, and then we'll have an open discussion with everybody about the content of the open letter, as well as the possible sort of action steps we can take around that. So that is the change for this morning. And I hope we have a great day today. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Sean now, who's going to introduce our opening speaker. And this is actually also a change from today's, what's typed in your physical schedule. We have a change in who the opening speaker is, and I'll let Sean introduce him. Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Great, comrades. I thought I'd just echo what Irene said. I thought yesterday's discussions on the regional reports from different countries from sub-Saharan Africa and the discussion on China was really, really useful and sets the stage for this discussion today, starting with just energy transition partnerships and the alternative financing ideas. But I'll leave that to Trevor because he's going to frame that discussion. But it's my pleasure to introduce the Deputy General Secretary of COSATU, Gerald Twala, formerly, I believe, out of SAMWU, the Public Services Union. And he's going to give a few words of welcome. We were fortunate enough to have the GS Soli here yesterday. And Nazima Vavi was also here yesterday, and he's going to come later today. So yes, please. Brother, comrade, would you like to come up and say a few words here when I'll vacate the chair for you?
Thanks very much, comrades, and good morning to all of you. Amanda, away too. Thanks very much, Program Director. Allow me on behalf of COSATU to bring you revolutionary greetings this morning on this second day of your meeting. We want to reiterate from the onset our appreciation for TUED in organizing this initiative to engage on the energy issues faced by the continent and the steps required to push for and demand a public pathway to renewable energy. Day one was very comprehensive and informative. We will all agree that we need more days to deliberate on every presentation and experience we had heard from other countries given a chance. We are gathered here to influence a public pathway for sub-Saharan Africa to address the challenges of an energy transition. Yesterday, we had a deep engagement on the science of growing support for a public pathway emerging in some parts of Africa. We received updates on developments from Africa, Latin America, and Europe. We also had policy updates from Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Uganda on the energy transition. We received a broad-based perspective on how trade unions are making significant move towards cleaner and more sustainable sources. We also learned about how trade unions contribute to shaping energy policies, advocating for workers' rights, and promoting a just transition. We learned about public pathway approaches to address energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and advocacy towards 100% access. We heard and discussed the general challenges of achieving universal electricity in sub-Saharan Africa. We were reminded about how most Africans residing in rural areas do not have access to electricity and how developing this infrastructure is costly. Neoliberal model for prioritizing full cost recovery have proven inadequate. In the panel, we heard from Mozambique, Ghana, Botswana, and Niger, and they explored public pathway strategies to ensure sustainable and equitable electricity access for all Africans, regardless of their location. China's electrification program must be applauded as a success. Comrades, I think all of us in this room dream of a national energy system that provides electricity access to all the citizens of their country. Yesterday, we learned that China did not adopt the neoliberal full cost recovery model promoted by the World Bank and the IMF, but instead pursued a path of a long-term planning through the central and local governments' collaboration. I think China's experience is very relevant to Africa, and we can learn a few lessons that are worth exploring. This workshop must continue to shed some lights and give us confidence that it is very possible to fight the energy crisis and that we will continue having relevant engagement to address energy challenges. Let me reiterate COSATU's final answer to Africa's energy crisis. The answer is straightforward. We need a public pathway towards our energy transition. In addition, we must learn from the past mistakes and ensure that corruption and poor decision-making do not derail these efforts. Allow me to conclude on this point and indeed wish you well on the remaining days of your workshop. Thanks very much. Amanda.
Thank you so much, Comrade Gerald, Comrade DJs. We're going to move, and I hope, please feel free if you have time to stay for this crucially important discussion. I'm going to invite the spokesperson for SAFTU, South African Federation of Trade Unions, Trevor Shaku, to moderate the session, frame the discussion, and perhaps the respondents to the discussion can join us. We are hoping that, well, we're still waiting for one or two people, I think. Why don't we begin with you, Trevor? Yeah, Basani is on her way. I think she was running late. Oh, she's here? I'm sorry, I can't see with this light on. But and Sung Hee, would you mind coming up? You can follow that. Yes, and we've got a comrade from the Indonesian Energy Union. I'm sorry. We have a comrade Andy from the Indonesian Energy Union. Indonesia is a just energy transition partnership country in the same way as South Africa. And he's got a presentation on his union's response to the JETP proposal for his country. And I think this is a very important first step in building some unity among the JETP unions from the JETP countries to come up with a unified response. But I'll leave that to Trevor and others. Fine. Thanks.
Thank you, Comrade Sean. Good morning to comrades and colleagues. I'm sure you would have seen on the program that we'll be discussing the JETPs and the element of structural green structural adjustment that are latent in those particular energy transition partnerships, which our countries have signed and others are beginning to sign with the IPG countries. So my role will be to facilitate and also to ground the discussion by giving first and foremost an intro. So sure. So the discussion, of course, is also covered in the framing document, and there would have been an annexures which were sent. I'm not sure, but I received one. I'm not sure if they were sent to all of you, but there were, which was an update of the South African JETP, which would have been developed for the meeting which took place last year in Kenya. And of course, there's been development since our meeting then. South Africa took the JETP forward and developed the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, which more or less was trying to break down that. But beyond that Just Energy Transition Partnership, investment plan for South Africa, there are other countries that have already signed their own Just Energy Transition Partnership. And those countries include Indonesia, Vietnam, and we know that Senegal and India are in the process of negotiating and concluding theirs. But of course, there are negotiating terms which have stalled conclusion of especially the Indian JETP. Now, I would like to situate the conversation on the JETPs on the question of the structure, the form and the character of capitalism today, because all of this is geared towards the structural adjustment, the blended and financing methods which are being proposed are all geared towards ensuring that they arrive or push us in a particular path of development insofar as energy transition is concerned. Now, 2 or 3 terms which I would like to just mention, I would return to them later before I give to the contributors, that take note of capitalism as a structure of our economy, neocolonialism as a character, especially of the countries in sub-Sahara, and neoliberalism as a form of the capitalism we have today. Because all of these particular key tenets feature in this particular process, and also in the form of power balances, which first go into the negotiations of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, but also in the conclusion and the implementation of such. Now, I also thought that I must begin this conversation with a quote from John Pegging's famous book, because there he was discussing energy transitions at the beginning of neoliberalism in the 70s. And it is very relevant, and you'll see how it is relevant. Let me just read that quotation and we'll continue. So he says, he's quoting, was having conversations with some of the people he was calling handlers. There were people who were handling him as an economic hitman. And of course, there were people he calls jackals, who mostly were the secret agents who instigated wars and conflicts in these particular countries. If those particular powers, political parties and leaders in those countries did not want to adhere to the dictates of imperial capitalism, especially as led by the finance institutions of capitalism, the World Bank and the IMF. So he says that he gets this response from a person called Razi. Give this one to the World Bank. See what it can do to make us some more money of Indonesia. So I'll just stop that quotation there. It is also very relevant because we're also discussing Indonesia. And Indonesia, Colombia, Panama, Mexico, Iran would have been part of the things he covered in this book. And most of them were centered around energy, because the United States and the Western imperialist powers wanted to ensure that they secure best deals, which were exploitationary, but also securing profits for the multinational and transnational corporations which were operating in those particular areas. And to a certain extent, they even influenced research tanks, which then came up with models which were rigged, models which were not realistic. But in order to convince the governments of those particular countries, you have to present a particular model that presents a very magical and a dramatic turn of events that would lead to a better life for all in that particular country. Now, let me delve into the JETPs, and I would just cite the common threads throughout all the JETPs. They first started with the South African one in Glasgow, COP26. Resolution 17, subsection 3 of that JETP with South Africa said, create an enabling environment through policy reforms in the electricity sectors, such as unbundling and improved revenue, underline an enabling environment. Then last year, at the end, they had two other JETPs they signed with Vietnam and Indonesia again. And this one from Vietnam, Resolution 24, subsection G says, create an enabling environment, underline it again, create an enabling environment for business to proactively participate in the transformation process, such as de-risking, underline again, facilitating equity and bank finance, underline, and also auctioning permits and speeding up licensing and enhancing competition, underline that section again. And then the JETP they signed with Indonesia, Resolution 3, subsection X says, mobilize sufficient capital to achieve the targets through grants, concessional loans, market rate loans to use in de-risking and catalyzing private investments. Underline the last section again. And then in the same JETP with Indonesia, still on Resolution 3, but now subsection 11 or XI, Roman figure 11, they say, private sector finance will be subject to catalytic public finance, underline that again. And they go again and say the public sector finance has the potential to generate private finance, underline that again. Now, in these JETPs, what is encapsulated is the green structural adjustment that we speak of, which mostly are because of the interests of capital of multinational capitalist corporations, which wants to use this energy transition to be able to make profits. Now, there are common threads which have run, and I said to you, you must underline them. Common threads that run through is first and foremost, the creation of an enabling environment. The second one is the fact that there ought to be a form of de-risking or government having to take on the risk of the private investors. And secondly, they also speak about markets and competition. So these key threads that run through the JETPs for these countries, and which of course are at the heart of JETPs which are being negotiated at the current moment, are, as I said, the encapsulation of the of the need by these multinational corporations to be able to privatize this process and be able to reap profits out of that. Now, let me get into what we would call the green structural adjustment. And you will see that the common threads I've identified actually are the key tenets of those green structural adjustments. And the first one is that, what do they mean when they say we must create an enabling environment? They say we must create an enabling environment, and they give some dictates in various ways. One of those dictates is that we must ensure that we create competition in the energy market. And that is already unfolding, for instance, in the case of South Africa, where two things are at play parallel, which are geared towards ensuring that the market is liberalized and competition is introduced en masse into that energy generation. The first one is that there is an introduction of the independent power producers, has been going on through in South Africa through the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. But of course, even in these countries, this is what is going to be imposed. So companies will be sought to enter into, these governments will sought to liberalize their energy generation and allow independent power producers to come into that space and play a role. What does that particular point lead us to? It leads us to the market, because if you have producers, capitalism has taught us that it operates for one sole purpose, and that sole purpose is to extract profits and maximize profits at all costs. And how do you do that? You do that at least by going through a particular channel. Is that you produce a commodity, and that commodity surplus value cannot be realized until it goes into circulation. Now, once you have allowed independent power producers to enter into production, you have to also ensure that you create a space and a market for them to circulate that particular product or service. Now, this is where the so-called independent system and market operators come into being, because they are also being encouraged by the World Bank and the IMF. In fact, South Africa is even ahead of that, because in the ESCOM regulation amendment bill, from section 30 to section 36, they've actually inserted a section there, or those sections that actually deals with ensuring that the market is liberalized, and you have the ISMO. You also have what they call the central purchasing agency, which will be incorporated into the transmission company or system operator. And this particular company will, of course, ensure that it also procures electricity from the generators and then sell it to the consumers. What does this do? We have been told all along that capitalism and entrepreneurship is about risk-taking. But what we see here is that the methods which have been proposed are actually about alleviating risks. So there's no longer actually a justification for capitalism to actually champion the energy transition, because all the way we are going to be the ones who alleviate and de-risk their investments. So in this context, we must be able to reflect very critically, because this is a point for us to be able to reject the privatization of energy provision in this particular process. Now, so then they propose this privatization pathway or private pathway, which we call the part of this green structural adjustment, because there are conditions upon which, if we are able to access their financing, we will have to follow. And part of that is to ensure that we privatize, and they want us to mostly opt for the PPP methods. And this brings me to a point, and I know that the panelists are going to elaborate on this very deeply, is the question of financing itself. The question of blended financing, risk alleviation, which is called de-risking in their documents, and all of that. And here we've got to take note of key things which are unfolding. Already we're witnessing them with the independent power producers in South Africa, but also we know as a matter of fact, the way capitalism is developing and the way capitalism has developed so far, it is more parasitic and wants to only sit on top of public finance or finance from developmental institutions so that it's de-risked, so that they are not actually experiencing risks which they should be exposed to. Because after all, that is what we were told they exist for, to take risks. Now, they enter what we call the demand guarantee. They want demand guarantees. Demand guarantees mostly is just that guarantee of the market. A person in the United States who would have been was born in Kazakhstan, they call him, he was contesting for a position of the comptroller, the people who monitor the banks and the banking system. They've published at Cornell Law Clinic, they've published a series of analyses of how capitalism has become so parasitic. And one of that is the question of demand guarantees. And how they put this is that these people actually use what we call multiple M's, the market delivering, market moving, market making. So part of this demand is actually that the government must make market for them, must secure market for them. They don't even have to stress about having to find consumers who would have to come and buy. And for instance, we know that ideally capitalism regulated by competition has to go through that particular process. But here, you don't have to go through that particular process because you have demand guarantees already given to you. But secondly, there are government guarantees that are going to de-risk these kinds of investments. And there would be blended financing, which would go mostly into public-private partnerships, which are going to be expounded more here. And in South Africa, would of course learn through the IPPs that they also are locking us in to contracts which do not give us a room to be able to maneuver and even to enjoy the benefits of that so-called competition when there is a lot of these independent power producers in the production. Because what we are told is that they come into the market, they are going to lead, like I said yesterday, deflationary impact on the prices because there are too many, there's competition. But the lock-in contracts which they are forcing us into are actually even making us to miss that ideal or potential benefit of low prices, because constantly, and we've experienced in South Africa, Busisiwe Mavuso, who was sitting on the board of ESCOM, revealed we don't agree with her because she's a pro-capitalist, an unrepentant one. But she came out to reveal some information which was very key, that the contracts which had been negotiated, the input costs which goes into ensuring that production takes place have increased, and therefore they are going to have to increase those tariff requirements or prices rather, that they said the price of procurement, they sell this electricity to ESCOM by about 65%, 12% on a yearly basis for about 5 years. So already we see problems there, but there are of course problems that goes into that. So let me not go deeper into that because the purpose of the panelists is to delve deep into all those nitty-gritties. But the basis which I wanted to establish for us to understand is that this is because capitalism, I said you must note it at the beginning, is because of the structure of capitalism. It is geared towards profit extraction. And because it's geared towards profit extraction, you do not have the opportunity in that process to be able to make anything developmental for the sake of that. For them, services and goods are produced not because they are use values, but because they can extract surplus value out of those particular use values. This is the first point. But the second point is that I said you must note neoliberalism. And the point of neoliberalism here is to bring us to the position where they trap, not really trapping us, but they make us believe that we do not have any other way of raising funds by saying there's high debt to GDP ratio levels, the budget deficits, and these have been debunked globally in the finance debates which are taking place between neo-Keynesians, the MMTers, and even the neoclassicals themselves. So we've got to take note of the fact that the self-imposed constraints on the ability of the monetary sovereign systems are actually non-existent. They exist because they are the ones who are telling us that they exist so that we run to them for financing. The neocolonial part of it, Gwame Nkrumah in his classical text, Neocolonialism, the highest stage of imperialism in Africa, would have said that neocolonial countries, you would see them because they have outward trappings. They look like sovereign nations, but they have outward trappings internationally. Their foreign policy is so limited. Now, in this instance, our policy is also to a large extent very limited, first in the flexibility on how and what type of policy for energy transition are we going to choose. So we've got to make sure that we factor both look at the structure, which is capitalism, when we know it's not going to lead to this transition properly, look at the form, which is neoliberalism, and look at the character of this economy, which is neocolonialism. And both, I think, will be able to arrive at a more substantive, well-informed critical view, which will take our debates forward. Thank you very much. And I'll give to. Sure. Thank you very much. I'm chairing. I thought you should clap at the end of the session. So let me just introduce quickly my panelists. We have Comrade Dr. Basane Baloyi, 2 titles, Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa. We have Comrade Andy Wijaya, Pesutian, I don't know how to read this, Pegawai Indonesia Power, PPIP. And then we have Comrade Mathurin Sagna from Senegal. I don't know how to read French. We have Comrade Sang-hee Ho. Comrade, you'll correct me. From South Korea, Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union. And we will have a presentation at a later stage from Dr. Thomas Marois. Yes, Marois from the University of London. So I'm a very strict chairperson. So to my panelists, you stick to time. The only grace time I can give you beyond is 1 minute. Our session is to last up until 11:20, which means we have exactly 1 hour, 20 minutes to do this. So I will allocate, they are all going to be part of the panelists are here, right? Even those crossing. Or there's one missing, so that I allocate time properly. Okay, so I will give 5 to 8 minutes at most to make your summaries on these issues. We'll have interactions. So
for Dr. Basani from IEJ, a little bit more time because of the work they've been doing on the JETPs. So, I think we said 10 to 15, just so we know. I don't want to compromise the other speakers, but IEJ has been, very prolific around this subject, and it would be a shame not to take advantage of that. And because the day has been restructured, we may be able to make a bit of extra time in this session. Yeah. Yeah. Apologies to that, Trevor. Should have let you know.
Good morning, comrades. So I think a lot of you probably, it seems as though you have the background knowledge on the JETP, so I'm not going to go deep into that at all. But I think for us, one of the presentation, what I will focus on are 2 elements, right? First of all is, can the needed finance be raised through the JETP? So the JETP has 8.5 billion committed financing, but there are 97 billion US dollars is the financing gap, right? So the question is, on the basis of a private pathway, will we be able to generate that 97, like, will this particular approach be able to generate that 97 billion? And then to also address the fiscal and legal and policy risks that surround the current approach, and then for us to begin to think about the financing alternatives that may be considered. So the first takeaway point is, if what we want is a just energy transition, so the move from high carbon intensity to a just energy transition into renewables, then the approach that is adopted by the JETP will fail to raise the necessary financing that is required of that, right? And channel private finance towards decarbonization, right? That's the key takeaway. That is the case both in South Africa and abroad. Therefore, failing to mobilize this required financing for the climate transition. The second is that the heavy reliance on private financing within the JETP opens up the South African government to a range of risks that undermine the objectives of the JETP. And then, as I said, I will begin to talk about ways in which we can start to think about how we can mobilize financing that is less costly, less risky, and that can support the justice elements of the transition. So let's first talk about the first takeaway points. Why do we say that the JETP, the current approach, will fail to meet the $98.7 billion financing gap over the next 3 years? The key is that the JETP is set within what we call a risk-based prudential macroeconomic framework, right? Some of those features of it have been presented in this panel and in other panels. The first is the fiscal conservatism. And this is the idea that there is not enough financial or fiscal space for the public sector or for government to intervene in to raise financing for the transition, right? So that's number one, right? And therefore, this then motivates the need to turn the billions of public financing to what is hoped to be the trillions in private financing. Okay, it comes from that. The second is monetary conservatism. And this is the idea that the core anchor of macroeconomic policy should be around price stabilization and fiscal stability or financial stability, right? So meaning that other elements of the macroeconomic framework, such as ensuring full employment, ensuring environmental sustainability, ensuring structural transformation, all of those are not important. Okay, so the core thing is around inflation and fiscal stability. Not fiscal stability, sorry, financial stability, which is, and fiscal stability, all of that, yeah. The third element is an industrial conservatism. Clara Matei calls this in her book the pursuit of privatization, right? Which is key. A more the traditional way of understanding industrial conservatism is in fact the the resistance by the state or to not intervene in the creation of or to not intervene in industrial policy by selecting particular sectors. You know, there's like sector neutrality. And so that is what is thought of industrial conservatism. But within the South African case, right, how we can think about this is the misalignment between the ambitions of industrial policy and green industrial policy, and then the financial means that are required to realize those ambitions. So there's a misalignment as a result between the financial macroeconomic policy and industrial policy, green industrial policy, right? So that is so it's the element of privatization and that misalignment within our case. And this then makes what the key features of a risk-based prudential macroeconomic are. Now, these key features are operationalized by what colleagues have already spoken about. The first is around market fixing, right? And here is the idea that in order for us to generate private financing that is geared towards the transition, you need to solve an asymmetry problem that the financial sector has, which is a misunderstanding or ignorance about what is defined as green and what is defined as dirty. So hence, that is the basis through which green taxonomies are born, right? So this is how we define what's green, and we need to just, the National Treasury or whichever body is meant to just make this information available. And then through that information, the financial market actors will be able to then use that information to price, to set, you know, to price to make price settings on a range of financial stocks or whatever, right? And so, and this is done voluntarily without, there's just solve the information asymmetry problem and this will happen. The other bit is the de-risking strategies, which you've already spoken about, which is, yes, indeed, about mobilizing public finance to reduce the risks of the public, but it's also to reduce political risks, right? And that is born in the way in which the contracts are spelled out, right? So to say that, you know, if there's any regulatory change over the next few years, the state needs to guarantee that that won't affect the contract. So that is very key, right? So it's about mobilizing, but it's also about securing a particular regulatory framework, and that is part of de-risking. So we note that there are several implications of this now macro risk-based prudential macroeconomic model. The first are the structural impediments. And what we argue is to say that the risk-based prudential macroeconomic framework systematically undermines underestimates the structural impediments to appropriate the resources that are required, right? So financing is mostly allocated towards established and well-capitalized companies that are able to access large scale capital markets financing, right? And so, you know, when you look at the structure of the fossil fuel industry vis-a-vis the renewables, is that the fossil fuel industry has consolidated ownership in that creates value for this sector through cost reductions within the value chain, expansionary projects to support growth, and strong negotiation power in contracting, right? And these features of a highly concentrated industry make it more attractive to institutional investors and financial capital. So in contrast, you have the renewable sector, which is currently fragmented with a supply chain that is relatively less integrated. And this could be seen as a market of, it's a marker of its nascence, but it's also a structural feature of the technology. So you have solar and wind power that are more globally distributed than is fossil fuel reserves. And renewables are typically not internationally traded through like in a dollar denominated, as a denominated commodity. Therefore, this also exposes would-be institutional investors to currency risks, right? And then you have institutional investors and asset managers that apply liquidity criteria as part of their investment decision-making process. And the majority of the renewable assets perform poorly against the liquidity preferences of these investors because of their relative low traded volume and small size, in comparison, for instance, to the fossil fuel. So this acts as, so this is something, this idea that if we mobilize public finance, the private sector will then, that will be sufficient for the private sector to make these investments is incorrect when you think about the structural determinants that drive both sectors. The other implication is around regulatory arbitrage, right? And the idea here is that, when you have financial actors, right, that operate outside of the oversight of the regulated banking sectors. You have shadow banks, you have hedge funds, and you have private equity, you have off-balance sheet financing structures that allow the financial sector to avoid attempts at reducing funding for dirty industry, for brown industries, for instance, right? And so what then you get is the fact that even though, you may be de-risking, because there is the spate of private equity funds that are in excess of 7 trillion in terms of funds under management, and you have the spate of hedge funds and all of you have an unregulated global financial architecture that can operate to bypass any kind of mechanisms that are meant to steer financing towards the green sector, towards renewables, right? So, and that again could typically undermine the need or the motive towards greater realizing the financing for this. And then there's the policy incoherence, where you have, for instance, a UK government that has, or the UK Reserve Bank, if you want to call it that, has got a green mandate, right? But because of, first of all, because inflation targeting and fiscal stabilities remains part of its green mandate, sorry, I'm going to have to be very quick. What you see is that because the way in which funding is directed in a way that you are not using open market operations to direct financing to particular sectors, right? You operate under like a sectorally neutral kind of macroeconomic framework, which is the case within us, right? It means that when, for instance, you may have this green mandate, but when, for instance, there's the energy shock and the prices, inflation becomes, and financial stability takes precedence over all other mandates, right? And so that becomes like endemic in the operation because financial stability overrides everything else. And so then there are several countries like the UK, France, the European Central Bank that have got different types of de-risking measures, but they hit against this policy incoherence because that goes against the primary objective, which is around inflation targeting, right? So even within that, the private sector is not necessarily responding. So therefore, the maintenance of narrow central bank mandates and instruments over and above mandates that would require the central bank, the central bank's alignment with government transition plans, limits what monetary policy can actually do, right? And then there are other particular risks, but I have been given very few minutes to make these points, but many of which you have discussed. But it does suffice to say that there are issues around, you know, much of our financing is debt instruments, and we don't have, like internationally, or we have not resolved for how we get debt resolution. Should such be required? Because this is a crisis that is generational in the making. We imagine that there will be different types of policies over time and different types of regulatory frameworks that need to be implemented to respond to crisis and to also meet socioeconomic rights. The challenge is that when you have these lock-ins that are not responsive to any changes, and you commit the state to a regulatory framework that is not responsive, right? Then it undermines the ability for us to actually have, it undermines policy autonomy, right? Because now what you have are, companies have the ability to sue the state of billions of rands for going against the contracting terms, which, I mean, you know, I think the comrade from Uganda spoke about how ESCOM took away $12 billion in a concession because these are part of the contract terms. And worse still, when you have a debt resolution that, first of all, where you know that private creditors are resistant to such, they will not take haircuts, right? And on top of which, they many of the arbitration is not settled in the country of origin, but rather settled internationally. That again limits. So the international arbitration does not happen within the nation state, right? It happens, a lot of these contracts, the international arbitration happens in other spaces, right? This then undermines, again, one's policy autonomy, okay? And then you have bilateral investment treaties that are part of these contracting deals. Now, South Africa has removed, and these are treaties between an investment company, which is multinational, and South Africa, that basically says that you are not going to subject our company, sorry, it's a bilateral between various states. So you are not going to subject German companies to particular regulations that that undermine its profitability. So you're not going to, so public procurement, for instance, is something that will not be part of this agenda. Other kinds of local content, we don't want local content. So these are things that are kept in these bilateral investment treaties. South Africa has done well to remove a lot of these bilateral investment treaties over time, and we only have a few left, right? Which then allows for some space, right? But you also have something that is called regulatory shopping, where in the bilateral investment treaties that we do have, because we still have those, you have companies that will set up shop in those countries and therefore ensure that those bilateral investment treaties continue, right? And so, and again, within those bilateral investment treaties, they'll say international arbitration, right? And this is then what is meant by, as you were saying, environment, like ensuring like an enabling and regulatory environment, right? These would be some of the requirements of ensuring that. And what you hit against is then regulatory chill, because you know you will be sued for 15 billion or $4 billion for reneging on contract, although you know that actually we need to restructure because something has happened. There's a sovereign debt crisis. This is the case of many countries such as Spain and others in Europe, who after the debt, you know, the European debt crisis, a lot of the renewable energy companies, right? There was structural reform where subsidies had to be removed from those renewable countries. I mean, those who were undergoing such a process. And 80 companies then sued many of these countries, and they could, right? Because these contracts allowed them to. And this is how then we talk about this, the undermining. Okay, so I'm going to flip to how then, like, start to talk about some of the, yeah, I'm wrapping up now. How then do we begin to start meeting this financing gap and ensuring a public pathway? The first is that monetary policy complementing, you know, what we need to do is obviously broaden our macroeconomic framework mandate, right? We need to ensure that the objectives of the macroeconomic framework are broader than price stability, that we need to have structural transformation, issues of environmental sustainability, employment, right, as key in our macroeconomic framework. And that our industrial policy, industrial and monetary policy utilizes what we call a green allocative credit policies that adjust the relative costs of providing capital to different sectors and intervene directly in setting the price or quantity of bank credit for particular sectors. So, you know, a key way in which a lot of the East Asian countries developed, and similarly in South Africa, is the fact that central banks gave mandates as to how credit was distributed and intermediated throughout the system, right? And so this is part of what we mean by an allocative green macroeconomic or green credit policy, where you have these the central bank that has this mandate that is broader, and then can make its open market operations on the basis of ensuring that there is full employment, ensuring that there is an energy transition, and there is structural transformation within that, right? But you would need to have industrial policy complementing that, right? And another key thing is around scaling up development banks and multilateral banks. So particularly, or scaling up public banks, right? And so these would then be the banks that receive this this kind of financing. But crucially, the loans that come through here must go through parliamentary oversight, because we know that there's a way in which structural adjustment can be implemented as part of to motivate for various kinds of conditionalities, right? Another is an assessment of the scope of fiscal policy to raise tax revenue, a process similar in scope in South Africa to the David Tax Commission. We know that you know, the World Bank has been, and a lot of donor money has not been going into boosting the administration of tax in many countries, right? But this would have to be crucial. And then within the South African context as well, there should be South Africa should rely on its domestic act on protection of investment as the governing framework of foreign investments, and refrain from agreeing to international arbitration for setting disputes with investors. and explicitly require disputes to be settled in domestic courts. And then, the South African government needs to mobilize social partners and developing country allies to push for improved regulatory oversight of shadow banking, institutional capital, and to secure a minimum 25% in direct grants over and above the existing ODA from global North donor countries. And the use of special drawing rights is also quite crucial as part of a response to the energy transition. Sorry, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me not waste time and hand over to the second speaker. It's Comrade Sagna. Yeah. Let me hand over the comrade from Indonesia.
Yes, brother. I already joined the Zoom.
Comrade from Indonesia Power Union is on the line now. So if that's okay with yeah, we're going to take the comrade from Andy from Indonesia. He's the General Secretary of the Power Union there.
Yes,
Comrade Andy.
yes, brother Trevor. Could you hear my voice? Is it clear?
We can hear you. Thanks.
Yes. And I have how many minutes, brother Trevor? Hello, is it my turn now?
Yes, yes. It's your
Okay,
turn.
okay.
You can speak, Kaida.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, comrade. My name is Andi Wijaya. I'm from Indonesia. Now I'm the General Secretary of PPIP Union. It's one of the subsidiaries of PT PLN, the electricity company, state-owned company. Now I'm gonna presentate about the JETP in Union electricity sector's perspective and how to give information about our position papers in the JETP. First, this is Indonesia, one of the country in Southeast Asia. We consist of 16,000 islands, more than 16,000 islands. And according to data, in 2002, there was electrification ratio in Indonesia is 99.63%. So it's almost 100% of the people in Indonesia is get electricity. This is the capacity and mixed energy in Indonesia. Okay. This is our capacity, 72.8 gigawatt. And this is the blue one, is state-owned company. The PLN, they run about almost 60%. And the private or the IPPs is donate 28.2%. And the other is government and for all needed. And this is the base of the power plant. I see here, this is the mixed energy. The green one, it's coal, it's dominating Indonesia's mixed energy, 63.5% is produced by coal. Produced by coal, and the renewable energy is 13.5%. This is geothermal, 5.63, the purple, and the blue, this is hydro, 7.5, and others are 0.33. This is the background. How do the COP is giving effect to the Indonesian? First, in COP 26, Indonesia established rules. They want to come out with mixed energy. Renewable energy will give 23% at 2025. Yeah, 23%. And in the COP27 in Egypt, Indonesia would establish net zero emission at 2060. Yeah, this is our condition now, mixed energy, renewable energy 13.55, and the fossil is 86.4. According to the slide before, in 2025, Indonesia were to increase the renewable energy from 13 to 23%. This is already 2023. We just did it 2 more years, but the condition now is only 13%. And from the electricity procurement business plan 2021 and 2030, Indonesia were to increase the renewable energy, become 51.6, and the coal is decreased from the fossil decreased from 86 to 48.4. This is the condition, and this is the planning for 2030. This is Indonesia renewable energy potential source. Indonesia is a tropical island where the islands of Indonesia is surrounding with the ring of fire, and 2 of third area is ocean. This is the potential. Geothermal, we have 28.9 gigawatt. Biomass, we have a lot of potential. Hydro, we have a lot of potential. But this is only the potential. This is the condition now in Indonesia. Now we have estimated oversupply of Indonesia is 56%. So the data before, you see we have capacity 72.8 gigawatt hour. 56 is not being used because it's oversupply. This is the condition, the first condition. The second is the mixed energy. Coal is renewable energy is 13.5, and the coal is 63. So we have a lot to catch up if we want to fulfill our program, the government program. And this is the most important. Comparison price sale subsidiaries PLN versus IPP or private. When PLN sell or produce electricity 4.3 cents USD and the IPP 6.7. It means the private sectors is sells 36% more higher than the PLN subsidiaries. This is the electricity tariff component. You know, electricity tariff to consumer consists of 2 components. First, the power plant, it donates 70% of the tariff, and transmission and distribution is 30%. So this is the tariff household in Indonesia for household customer April and June 2023. You see, we only sold 2.8 cent USD, 4.1 cent USD, 9.1 cent USD, and the highest is 11.6 cent USD. But this is the price from the power plant side on the energy primary use. hydro 1.2, coal 4.6, oil 20.8 cents, gas 19.6, geothermal 8.8, combined cycle 9 cents, solar panel 24 cents. This is the data that we have, and it's only donate 70% to the actual tariff that being sold to the customer. So the price from the renewable energy hasn't affordable for Indonesian people. This is union position paper. There was a constitutional court decision number 001, 021, 022 in 2003, and decision number 111 in 2005. The two decisions emphasize that electricity is included in the production branch that important for the state and affect the livelihood of many people, and therefore must be controlled by the state. That means the electricity is included to our constitutional Article 33, paragraph 2. So the electricity must be controlled by the state.
Comrade
Control,
Andy,
yes.
you know I'm that infamous chairperson. Can you wrap up?
Okay. Control mean there were foresight, license function, management function, legislation function, and oversight function. So we, the union, support this transition energy partnership if one, not against the constitution specifically Article 33, paragraph 2, no privatization. The second is affordable selling price for the people. You know, the slide before tell that the green energy is not so affordable for Indonesia people, and the three is safety to consumer, and that was our union position paper. And that's all, Trevor. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Comrade Mathurin Sagna from Senegal, UTDS. Yeah.
Bonjour camarades. Amandla. Merci. Donc je me présente, je m'appelle Mathurin Sagna. Je suis le secrétaire général du syndicat national des travailleurs du pétrole, du gaz et des activités connexes du Sénégal. Donc mon syndicat est composé de transporteurs hydrocarbures, de travailleurs qui sont dans les énergies renouvelables aussi. Et donc, ceux qui sont dans le pétrole en gros. Voilà. Donc, je tenais à remercier ma camarade Mariama Diallo, qui m'a associé à cette réunion, ainsi que toute l'équipe de TUED pour l'invitation. C'est ma première participation à une réunion de cette envergure. Je me réjouis d'être parmi vous, soyez-en certains. Considérez que je suis là pour apprendre des expériences de mes camarades issus des autres pays, donc qui ont déjà débuté l'exploitation des ressources pétrolières, gazières et sur les énergies renouvelables. Permettez-moi de faire un petit résumé sur le Sénégal, qui vient d'adhérer au groupe des pays producteurs de pétrole et qui est, malgré tout, un pays pauvre très endetté. Parce qu'on peut avoir du pétrole, mais on est endetté. Il faut le dire. Donc, pour une transition juste, une transition énergétique juste, il faut que les syndicats et les forces politiques progressistes s'assurent que les ressources pétrolières, gazières profitent au peuple. Toutes les ressources extractives d'un pays appartiennent au pays, donc au peuple. Aujourd'hui, nombre de pays producteurs exportent leur part de pétrole grâce à des contrats de partage de production signés entre les États et les compagnies pétrolières opératrices. Ces États engagent les ressources de leur pays qui devraient permettre le développement économique. Or, il n'en est rien, ou si peu. Pourquoi? Les compagnies pétrolières contrôlent tout. En effet, elles exportent leur propre part en baril, mais aussi celle des pays producteurs qui n'ont pas les moyens d'avoir une flotte pour le transport de leurs produits bruts. Les États sont donc obligés de payer pour faire transporter leur part ou la revendre aux pétroliers. La dépendance des États producteurs de pétrole, et notamment africains, est considérable. Production, transport, distribution hydrocarbures sont entièrement entre les mains des compagnies pétrolières opératrices. Ils dépensent tout l'argent issu de la vente du pétrole pour racheter des produits raffinés et doivent emprunter aux banques internationales, aux banques privées occidentales ou au FMI pour couvrir leurs besoins. Qui en profitent réellement? Les banques et les pétroliers, qui sont exploités, dépossédés de leurs richesses, les pays producteurs et le peuple. Car lorsque les ressources seront épuisées, le pays sera criblé de dettes. Il y a donc pillage des ressources grâce à un mécanisme tout à fait séduisant, avec des habillages qui font croire à du donnant-donnant, d'échanges commerciaux et d'intérêts mutuels. Il n'en est rien. Il faut que les pays émergents africains puissent développer à minima leur propre raffinerie et leur propre réseau de stations-service pour couvrir leurs besoins et éviter de s'endetter à perte. Un combat syndical et politique primordial pour le développement économique du Sénégal, qui est en train de découvrir des ressources pétrolières et gazières importantes qu'il va falloir développer. Au-delà des revendications spécifiques qu'il faut bien traiter au quotidien, les enjeux pour le pays sont aussi de la responsabilité d'un syndicat de classe et de masse. Il doit faire des propositions économiques dans l'intérêt du peuple. Avec l'accélération du réchauffement climatique, du réchauffement et du changement climatique, il faut décarboniser l'énergie, ce qui amènera une forme de souveraineté à chaque pays. Puisque le soleil et le vent sont notre richesse, utiliser les ressources naturelles pour amener vers une souveraineté énergétique, c'est absolument indispensable et qui est dans son mix énergétique. Sénégal, 42% des énergies renouvelables. Le budget est composé de l'éolienne, de l'air et de l'hydraulique. Les énergies renouvelables par essence sont décentralisées. Elles s'installent partout. Le stockage et la tout au long de la journée pour éviter des pertes. Parce que quand même, quand un nuage passe au-dessus des panneaux solaires, on constate qu'on a des pertes. Sachant qu'il faut alléger les taxes douanières sur le matériel. De l'énergie renouvelable, c'est que le soleil, nous le voyons chaque matin, mais nous n'en voyons pas la facture. Je vous remercie.
Thanks. Zhang He from the Korean Public Service and Transport Workers Union.
Irene is going to share screen. Irene is going to share screen. So yeah, I'm waiting for her. Irene. But I'll be a little bit longer than 7 because I was not informed. Yeah, maybe 10. Sorry.
Hey, good morning, comrades. I'm here today to present the energy policy in Korea and the trade union response, and to explore the problems of international climate finance and present recommendations to address the problems through a case study of the Green Climate Fund that KPTU conducted in collaboration with Public Services International and KCTU last year. After the IMF bailout in Korea, the Korean government's neoliberal privatization of the energy sector through unbundling and sell-out was blocked by the KPTU's 38-day strike in 2002. But over the past 2 decades, the energy sector in Korea has seen an ever-increasing influence of private conglomerates and a strengthening of the energy for-profit system through the expansion of IPPs and PPAs, increased direct imports of natural gas by private companies, and attempts to open up the electricity sales market to the private sector. Next, please. So until 1997, the South Korean electricity system was owned and operated by a single, fully vertically integrated public company, the Korean Electric Power Corporation, KEPCO. In 2001, the generation sector was separated from KEPCO and split into 6 public power generation companies, while KEPCO remained as a transmission, distribution, and retail company and is still fully publicly owned. Since then, competitive pressure and the quest for profitability have continued to intensify for power utilities, resulting in the neglect of publicness of energy by the government's policy of expanding privatization. The drive for profitability has also encouraged outsourcing to reduce costs and has led to a deterioration in workers' conditions, including lower wages, unsafe working conditions, and increased job insecurity. Next, please. While the current government's policy of expanding nuclear power plants may reduce the share of renewable energy generation, the long-term transition to renewable energies mandate continues to grow. In this process, the amount of government subsidies provided to the private renewable energy operators is increasing in the structure of the privatized renewable energy generation industry. And the government is promoting the expansion of renewable energy in a way that puts private power generation at the center, with public power companies supplementing in some areas. It is expected to continue and encourage to promote offshore wind power projects that involve foreign capital and financing. Next, please. While the government has announced that it will shut down some of its old coal-fired power plants by 2034, it has continued to allow the construction of 7 new coal-fired plants by private companies, thus tolerating increase in greenhouse gas emissions and the expansion of private power companies. In addition, the system of direct imports of natural gas for own use by private power companies was changed in 1997 from an authorization system to a notification system, which expanded the entry of private companies into the natural gas industry. More recently, the direct import of natural gas has led to the entry of hydrogen businesses related to natural gas. Next slide, please. So as a result, the private sector accounts for 35% of electricity generation and 20% of natural gas imports. Next, please. The government continues pushing for an increase in electricity prices, which can be seen as a preliminary work to establishing a cost-based pricing principle for electricity and the opening of the electricity sales market to the private sector. The government claims that the electricity tariff hike is a measure to deal with KEPCO's deficit, but given that the tariff hikes has been promoted as a preliminary work to many privatizations, such as the railways, there is reason to believe that it is to ensure high prices in order to make a profit when private companies enter the electricity sales market. Next, please. In line with the Korean government's energy policy, KEPCO has been steadily expanding its overseas project, starting with a coal-fired power plant in Malaya, the Philippines in 1995. As of the end of December 2022, it is engaged in 45 projects in 24 countries around the world. In terms of numbers, 29 out of 45 overseas projects are related to renewable energy. Next, please. But if you look at the power generation capacity, the capacity of fossil fuel power generation is more than 6 times that of renewable energy. In particular, in 2020, South Korea invested around $46 million of public funds to build 2 coal-fired power plants in Indonesia and Vietnam, which is contrary to climate justice. Next, please. Over the past 3 years in Korea, we have seen the consolidation of an alliance of organizations, politicians, experts, and media advocating a market-based approach in South Korea. Millions of dollars a year from various foundations, especially those run by transnational conglomerates in Europe and the United States, have been channeled to some market fundamentalist groups that advocate only a transition to renewable energy, whether public or private, and instead of promoting a just transition, try to cleverly greenwash existing privatizations. Next, please. So the best example of this was the reaction of these organizations to the announcement of the National Pension Fund to divest from coal companies. The National Pension Fund Korea is a public fund with around $783 billion. The fund has invested around $2.3 billion in 5 public power generation companies. In 2022, the National Pension Fund declared that it would limit its investments in coal companies based on the average revenue of the coal industry over the last 3 years. As a result, the fund's divestment from coal companies has been focused on 5 public power generation companies, which is responsible for 40% of the country's electricity provision. At a time when a public-centered energy transition requires public power companies to be more active in renewable energy projects, and when the government's profit-driven public enterprise policy is forcing 5 public power companies to reduce their renewable energy investment plans by at least $1.6 billion by 2026, the withdrawal of these investment funds is a deliberate inducement to bankrupt of the public energy system, which will inevitably lead to the expansion of private power generation and the privatization of the energy industry as a whole. Nevertheless, organizations based on market fundamentalism have played an active role in advocating for private power companies, emphasizing the urgency of a decarbonized energy transition while abandoning the values of a public-centered energy policy. Next, please. In response to the government's privatization policy, the KPTU fights for a public transition based on the strengthening of the publicness of energy and demands the following: the consolidation of the 5 divided public power generation companies into systematic renewable energy projects with localized management structures, the establishment of democratic governance that guarantees the participation of workers and users who are most affected by the energy transition and climate policy making process, the abolition of the current system of the direct import of natural gas and the municipalization of IPPs, the sharing of profits from private projects which are monopolized by operators and financial investors. The KPTU is seeking to extend its climate justice activities which for the past 2 years have been limited to trade unions in the energy sector, to other sectors affected by the climate crisis, such as public transport, hospitals, aviation, and local government sectors. Next, please. At the same time, the KPDU is extending its solidarity beyond the trade union movement to the climate justice and environmental movement, organizing different actors who agree on the demand to strengthening of publicness for a public-centered just transition. The most recent achievement was the organization of a climate justice strike on April 14th, in which more than 300 trade unions and civil society organizations formed an organizing committee and around 3,000 people participated. Next, please. Finally, I would like to highlight the issue of international climate finance through a case study of the Green Climate Fund. Given that the historical responsibility for the climate crisis lies with the rich countries of the global north, and that its impacts are being felt most acutely in the low-income countries of the global south, developed countries has an obligation to provide developing countries with the finance and technology needed to combat the climate crisis or climate reparations to redress this reality. As a part of this, the GCF was established in 2010, with developed countries pledging to reach an annual contribution of $10 billion by 2020 to support developing countries. However, the GCF has only raised $62 million in 2020, which pales in comparison to the findings of a 2022 UNEP report. At least $4 to $6 trillion per year is needed to transition developing countries to a low carbon economy. Next, please. Beyond the insufficient size of the fund, the real problem with international climate finance, including the GCF, is that it operates within the neoliberal framework of green growth, packaged as green, and is driven by private rather than public pathways, with public funding limited to de-risking and ensuring the profitability of private investment through public-private partnerships or blended finance. Next, please. In particular, there are 3 issues as following. The concentration of funding through international access entities has resulted in projects being led by implementing entities rather than by the governments in the countries where the projects are implemented. Next, please. Inadequate support for adaptation projects, with more funding going to mitigation, which is easier for the private sector to monetize than adaptation, and less to small island developing states where the impact of the climate crisis is more severe. A response to the climate crisis based on this dominant neoliberal approach will further entrench socioeconomic inequalities between the North and South. Next, please. A higher proportion of loans, equity investments, and other forms of finance than grants, and a higher proportion of blended finance. Loans are the main form of financing that ensures a profit of the lender. This increased the already high debt burden of developing countries. Next, please. So the study makes the following recommendations. So international climate finance and the Green Climate Fund should embrace universal quality public service provision as a key principle and include safeguards against privatization or corporatization of essential services. Developed countries should actively embrace historical justice and provide their fair share of international climate finance to meet the needs of developing countries. The Green Climate Fund needs to strengthen its position on climate finance as a public good and abandon its continued emphasis on the role of private capital. The Green Climate Fund must engage public sector workers and service users as key parties. The global tax system should be reformed to raise important revenues to fund climate finance as a public good. Next, please. So the KPT will continue to stand in solidarity with the labor and climate justice movements in South Korea against privatization policies, as well as with trade unions in the Asia-Pacific region, especially those that are severely affected by the climate crisis and threatened by privatization through international climate finance, to further contribute to the expansion and strengthening of public-centered energy policies in the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Sang-hee.
Yeah, obviously this session has gone a little bit over long. We got off to a later start. But Tom Maroy who's written a book on public banks, we'd like to hear his intervention now. So we plead for your patience to hear his intervention, and then we can take a break afterwards. I hope that's okay with everybody. He's waiting online for a while, and we'd like to include him right now. Let's just let him do the presentation, I think.
Dr. Thomas, the opportunity is yours to make the presentation. Roshedi. Okay.
Thanks for your patience, comrades. This is part of the work we're doing. The rough edges.
Okay, Comrade Trevor, I'm ready with the presentation.
Yeah. Dr. Thomas, may you start presenting?
Sure, thank you. Am I able to share my screen?
Darren, he can share. Okay. Yes.
It says I has disabled the screen sharing when I'm trying.
They will enable you in a moment. Ready?
Okay.
You can share.
Very good. Everyone can see that? Okay, I'll begin then. And thank you all for your patience, and thank you for the invitation. A quick ask for moral solidarity. Right now we're on strike at my university in London, basically under 100% lockout from the employers due to a marking assessment boycott. So I'm especially thankful to be speaking with you today on this topic of exploring public banks and alternative financing. I know it's the end of your session, so I will move through these slides as quickly as I can. There's an important point I want to make in terms of this topic of public banks for just energy transitions, and is the key point that there is no pathway to financing energy transitions that will not go through public banks. That doesn't mean that they will necessarily be just, but it positions public banks as a moment of struggle and a central moment of struggle in the financing of energy transitions. And this is because primarily public banks and private finance and private financiers are as eager to mobilize public banks for private financing, just as Comrade Sung Ying had just mentioned, to support private profitability now far more than in the past. They're in fact supporting the use of public money, public banks, multilateral financial institutions in order to support their own profitability. So there is no pathway to energy transitions that are not going through public banks. And the question is, what's to be done about that? The first point I was asked to make is basically that there is really a huge world of public banks out there that are already existing. Public banks we can define as a bank that is owned by a government. It can also be one that is governed by public authorities, or a public bank can be a bank that is also run by public law, and all these governance, ownership, law can define a bank as a public bank. There are still more than 900 of these institutions worldwide. They're in every corner of the earth, and they hold collectively over $49 trillion in assets. That is, larger than the GDP of the United States, Germany, and China combined. In fact, 10% larger than that. And even within Africa and the African continent, there are between, depending on what you call a, public bank or a financial institution, more, between 40 to 70 different institutions that you can visit the African Association of Development Finance Institution website to see where these are located, and they may be and likely are in your country. A point that I want to make is that public banking, needs to be thought of as a public purpose institution. This is not a natural thing. There are very strong examples, such as the Dutch Water Bank, where its mandate, its mission is very much so we are a bank of and for the public sector that enjoys good relationships with local authorities and the central government. By contrast, where I'm from, originally in Canada, they created a new infrastructure bank, public infrastructure bank, under the guidance of BlackRock investors, where the purpose of that bank is to invest and to seek private investment. So this is exactly the opposite of what we want. Both are public banks, both have very different mandates. And this is what we need to be attentive as unionists and as people concerned with just energy transitions. I want to take a few minutes to talk about what alternatives public banks potentially offer, again, because they don't necessarily do so. So one thing, I've been looking at concrete examples here. Public banks can set green floors as a matter of policy. So the Nordic Investment Bank recently in 2021 set a policy that it will no longer finance any fossil fuel-based energy generation, period. They can also become catalysts for municipal transformation. A recent study we did in Turkey on İlbank, which is a provincial bank owned and operated by the various states or provinces of Turkey. The results of that study is that no one can compete because no one can lend more cheaply. They can really become, catalysts for cheap financing, for local development, for municipal transformation. And importantly, they can also be institutions for mobilizing domestic finance. So in Morocco, the Fonds d'équipement communal, the basically municipal financial entity, borrows 90% of its funds in domestic markets. And what that does is not only reduces dependency on foreign funds and external financiers, but in doing so, it reduces the exchange rate risk for the public sector and for local authorities. Public banks are also important insofar as they can be strongly mandated institutions. They are mandate-based. And we can look at an example in Colombia, a recently created institution, Findeter, which is a sort of a development bank, a public development bank, where its mandate is to be the strategic partner of national government and territorial entities for the planning, structuring, financing, and execution of sustainable projects that transform territories. Its specialty is financing municipalities and local authorities at rates cheaper than those offered at the market rates in the standard, financial markets or from private sector. And one of my favorite examples of a public bank is one in Costa Rica called the Banco Popular, which exemplifies the potential for public banks to create not only public-public partnerships, but cooperative public-public partnerships. And in this case, the bank partnered with Copelesca, which is a cooperative energy producer in the Central Valley of Costa Rica, to purchase land around the national park that you can see in the bottom right-hand side that was being overfarmed and overused, to rewild that area to protect the water source that generates the energy for the Central Valley of Costa Rica. In the process of creating that cooperative public relationship with the bank, they developed another public relationship with the National University in Costa Rica on the top left corner to create an interpretive center and a study center for university students to go to better understand processes of rewilding natural reserves and the protection of natural resources in a country. So very inspirational cooperative public-public partnership that was triggered by the Banco Popular giving a low concessional rate, a cheaper rate of interest. I won't go into this in depth, but just this is some work that I did with Public Services International recently, setting out what a pro-public public bank would look like based on a green and just mandate, looking at what are its sources of capital from government, from markets, how is it lending at market rates or below market rate, policy-based, and importantly, what are the models of governance? What can we look at in terms of democratic, representative, inclusive, transparent, and accountable forms of governance? The key point I want to make here is that public banks are not necessarily, but can be made as a policy maximizing entity, not a profit maximizing entity, and neither profit maximizing for the bank, the public bank itself, or for the private sector. These should be guided by policies that are geared around just energy transitions. This is not natural. Public banks are contested institutions. The private sector does want to exert control over them and control the ways in which public banks function and operate. They're not essentially good or bad, but it really depends on the social forces that shape the institutional functions that give meaning to that bank being public. So they are only ever as good as we make them to be. And you can see this in the various types of institutions and mandates and operations that are evident around the world. Let me finish my intervention just to highlight some of the tasks that we set out in the PSI paper for trade unions to begin or to put this on their agenda. One task certainly is to identify if there are public banks if you're in the region and if they are engaged in funding energy infrastructure. If there are, meet with them. Meet with the public bank, discuss shared and differing priorities for funding just energy transitions, and report back to your comrades, back to TUED South, on what works best and what works worst, what isn't working for public banks in energy transitions. And in this way, we can begin to shape public banks more in the public interest in a pro-public way, and begin to claw back some of the capture that we're seeing from the World Bank and from private finance over the future tasks of public banks in energy transitions. Thank you very much for your time. I know it's the end of your morning session, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some ideas with you.
Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Thomas. Give me guidance. We go to. And is this the end of the session also?
I think we've almost 2 hours in session. I suggest, if it's okay, to take a break now. Then the organizers here will have a little huddle in the corner and decide whether we're going to have a bit of space for discussion and then move into the next session immediately after, or just go straight into the next session. Mike?
Tom, are you able to stay or come back if we take a 20-minute break now, and we want to do a discussion afterwards. For
Sure,
like 15
Sure, I can
minutes or
come
so?
back in if you, I'd be happy if that's the decision.
Okay, if you have time, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So pop
yeah,
back in
maybe we
20
can make
minutes?
Some time. Yeah, so I think we'll take a 20-minute tea break and then we'll come back and have a little discussion based on the presentations this morning. Yeah, okay. Yes, please do.
Okay, will do.
Hey, okay. Let me thank the panelists. You can now clap hands. Thank you, comrades.
Comrades, let's get started.
We don't have time. Let's reconvene. Can we settle? Can we settle? I'll be. Can the comrades also come to the front? So brief questions, comrades. We only have 15 minutes of interaction, and I'm gonna try to get comments and questions out of you within 10 minutes and 5 minutes of replies from my panelists. It will be very difficult, but I'll have to manage that. Can I take hands? 1, 2, in that order, 3, 4, 5. Is there any other hand I did not see? On Zoom, Comrade Irene, is there any? None. Okay, leadership.
Thank you very much. My question is directed to Thomas. The issue of, the role of central banks in financing generally a just transition. I hear the issue of public banks, but I'm of the view that obviously public banks have got to be allocated some financing through central banking. What is the role then of, what will be the role, the progressive role of central bank in terms of just transition, particularly in developing economies? Thank you very much.
Comrade Evelyn, Dr. Evelyn.
Yeah, thank you so much, comrade. My submission comes from the issue of broadening macroeconomic mandates beyond price stability. Now, the comrade talked about increasing employment. Maybe we need to know how would the increase in employment translate to more availability of funding, because that is going to be very important. And then it is also quite important to understand when you talk about ISDSS, that is Investor State Dispute Settlement Agreement, okay? What is the, at what point does the Just Transition Partnership actually bring them on board? Because that is going to be very clear. In what instances, you talked about the case of South Africa, what are the clear clauses in terms of that might actually lead to the Investor State Dispute Settlements within the WTO mechanism? And then finally, just to interest ourselves, maybe the comrades there should actually read about the ISDS cases, because Egypt is one of the countries that has actually had to pay 2 billion shillings for simply changing a policy in the interest of the public. So that even as we talk about it, as South Africa talks about it, then they should be able to understand why do we make this. Then finally, candidly, many of us in these rooms are not accountants. So next time when we're using a lot of big grammar, please take into account that some of us are not accountants. So tone it down in terms of submission. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. My first question is directed to Comrade Basani. It's in relation to what they need to fill the financing. So I just need some clarity, because you spoke about obviously the JETP being 8 billion, and then you said that there's a 97 billion of financing gap. So my understanding of that is that if we talk about a financing gap, then we are making the underlying assumption that we would have then taken the 8 billion. And in terms of my understanding, the narrative from labor, from civil society is that we're not going to take the 8 billion, so that all of the ultimate financing will come from the public, right? So I just needed some clarity in terms of that. And then no, just one last question. You also spoke about the bilateral investment treaties that are currently existing. You spoke about the fact that we have gotten rid of a lot of them, but there's still few in existence. My question is, how far are we in getting rid of the few? How long will it take, and will this improve the situation insofar as the discussions are concerned? Yes.
I think it's Comrade, yeah, it's you. Comrade Dominic.
Thanks, Comrade. I have two quick points. The second kind of leads to a question. The first comment relates to macroeconomic constraints, and there I think over and above policy mandates in relation to price stability, we should also be cautious and wary of the need for balance of payment stability, because this in itself entrenches a neoliberal economic framework and necessitates the need to raise the resources to finance debt service costs from increased financialization, and of course export-led growth models becomes at the expense of investments in local economies. But more than that, I think that we see how this also leads to an additional point to your important presentation, is that how it leads to high domestic market interest rates, given the inequities within global currencies and the implications for currency stability. So I think these must be factored in. And I mean, in part, I wonder then, do multilateral development banks not represent similar threats as other international finance institutions? That's not to say that in principle being against them, but I think it requires lots of work to transform it. And then I'm wondering, in terms of a triage system, is that the best immediate way to get finance? Okay. And that brings me to my second point, which is in line with this idea of public-public partnerships. And I think one potential pool of finance that's missing from the conversation is the role of public pension funds and what they can potentially play in unlocking the resources needed for investment in infrastructure. And of course, by investing, for example, in the infrastructure for an energy transition on a public pathway approach, could in fact have the multiplier effect of bolstering the pension fund through greater levels of employment within energy and the downstream industries. And you know, I just did a quick search to look at public pension funds in Africa, and this is where I end. And that is to say, they are not insignificant in size. Egypt, $6.2 billion, Ghana, $4.7 billion, Kenya, $13.7 billion, Namibia, $11.8 billion, Nigeria, $32.6 billion, South Africa, a whopping $110 billion. And most of these resources are invested in the financial economy, and public workers often have some control over where these investments go. Is this not part of what we need to advance in terms of a public pathway approach, public-public partnerships? And should we not do a bit more research on what potential pools of finance are within public pension funds, what they are currently, what the investment mandates are, and if they can be potentially redirected to investing in a kind of green industrialization program, as opposed to a green structural adjustment program that we're seeing now? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just listening to the experience in South Africa, was coming up in Senegal, what the comrade from Indonesia spoke about. I think this will be a good space to try to get a collective response on the just transition or just energy transition partnerships, which are basically taking the same model to every country. And we're already finding that the trade unions share a very similar perspective. But so far, at the global level, there hasn't really been a critical voice on behalf of the union movement talking about this. So just a suggestion, is this something that we can work towards? Getting members from the countries that are being affected directly with the support of all the other ones to say, why not, or what kind of energy partnership we want, let's say. But I think the coincidences between your presentations are there, and I just think it would be good to take it to the next step, which would be trying to bring it more to the public sphere.
Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes indeed. Oh, there are hands. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Comrade Irene, this will interfere with the time you gave me. We'll just extend. We're left with 4 minutes on the time you allocated. And
Why don't we go till 12, and then the next session has 50 minutes, and then, yeah, okay. Thanks.
1 minute each. 1 minute, brother. One minute.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Chair. My question will go to Comrade Dr. Busani Baloyi around the macroeconomic policies and the implications that the loans have on the macroeconomic policy. You talked on how the loan conditions are not stipulated, and those conditions impose some sort of restrictions to our macroeconomic policies. And as a result, countries are forced to practice some financial stability or financial prudence in order for them to maintain some kind of stability within their economy. But now the issue is that maintaining financial prudence comes with a lot of impact on our macroeconomic policies, such as increased unemployment rate, issues of lack of investment on our public services, poor health services, collapsing health sector, and issues of lack of housing, for instance. So all these public services are affected as a result of countries having to maintain this financial prudence or stability. That then results to an economic instability. Now, the question is, how are these institutions, financial institutions, then benefiting from a country that has a collapsing economy as a result of them being forced to actually maintain this financial prudence that have been imposed in these loans that they get granted. Let me end it there. Thank you.
Sean will be the last and can help assist in answering. Comrade Andile, and then.
Just a general question for the panel. How do we bring our critique of the JETP into the public sphere? Specifically, if we're trying to get people mobilized in resistance to this green structural adjustment, a lot of the language in the JETP is to most people confusing, jargony, and on the other hand, public power utilities across the continent are ailing. So if we're trying to mobilize people, what kind of political language are we going to use to get people to understand what the JETP is and why it needs to be resisted? Thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Je ne serai pas long, mais vu hier, par rapport à le cas de la Chine, je me suis dit au niveau du Sénégal, nous sommes trop en retard. Et ceci pourquoi et comment on va faire? Nous devons nous lever, nous les syndicalistes, la société civile et tout le monde, pour échanger, discuter, surtout sur les contrats, en signant les contrats avec la Banque mondiale, la FMI, la BAD. Il faut que les syndicalistes soient présents dans ces comités pour qu'on sache exactement qu'est-ce qu'on signe. Et les dettes, la dette sénégalaise est énorme. Et comment on va faire pour effacer cette dette? Et alors que nous sommes un pays très riche en matière, en énergie renouvelable, je vais en parler demain, mais toujours je me dis pourquoi, comment on va faire pour que le Sénégal aille en avant, et alors que dans l'IMOA, le Sénégal fait partie des premiers pays en matière énergétique. Et jusqu'à présent, on est toujours endetté, donc nous devons travailler en tant que syndicalistes sur tous les contrats signés par la Banque mondiale. Merci beaucoup.
Really quickly, and I think this will probably, we should flag this for the final day when we talk about next steps, but I would like to suggest that in the room we have, in a sense, Indonesia, we have Senegal, and we have South Africa, with the three principal countries other than Vietnam. We don't have union contacts in Vietnam yet, although we are working on that. Remember, the trade union movement is structured differently in the Vietnamese context. But there is a fight going on within the Vietnamese Communist Party over this issue of liberalization and JETPs, which we are aware of. So I suggest that we have a small group, a meeting between the Senegalese comrades here and the comrades interested in the fighting the JETP, the financial dimensions, and also link up with Andy in Indonesia. Maybe we can have a small caucus. On that similar point, I think we should also flag the idea of a subgroup working on alternative finance within TUED South, because there's some knowledge now in the room that wasn't in the room in Nairobi, who really know these issues. And I think, and with comrades like Tom willing to help, and he's often extended his offer, we can do that. So I think we should also consider that as a possibility. And I think that somewhat addresses Andile's issue. He's raised a very good point. We can oppose stuff, but what's our alternative? And if we can expedite the development of our alternative in a way that can get into the public discourse, then that's why we set up this project, is to begin to provide an answer to what is being proposed, because otherwise we'd just be seen as complainers who've got nothing else to say. And last point on this, and it'll come up in the later in sessions today, there are cracks in the multilateral system that are very deep now over the question of global public goods, sustainable development, massive cracks, and really questioning the whole structure of the role of the international financial institutions from within the international financial institutions. So they're not a monolith, and I think we should make those cracks wider. So let's talk about that in future sessions. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much. Let me give to Comrade Basani, and then because I think questions only posed to two, Comrade Thomas and Comrade, and you have a loaded.
Just to say thank you to my fellow panelists. It was amazing listening and hearing about your context. So the first question around broadening the macroeconomic framework, increasing increase in employment as part of the macroeconomic mandate. How do we raise more funding towards this? So basically, the central bank has a mandate, right? Which is around ensuring price stability, like ensuring that there is no inflation and also ensuring financial stability. And part of that financial stability, to my comrade Dominic, would be balance of payments as well, right? So it's all encompassing of what we mean by financial stability. The issue for us is that why don't we broaden that mandate, right? So that whatever the operations that the central bank does, which is buying and selling of bonds, for instance, from like, or issuing currency, or setting of interest rates, that in so doing, it needs to ensure that it needs to do those operations through another mandate, which is ensuring full employment, right? Meaning, if we are in a crisis of unemployment, right, and the central bank's mandate is around employment creation, then the lowering of interest rates to ensure that companies can invest, because now you've reduced the borrowing costs, the costs of financing, becomes key. And you decrease interest rates in order to stimulate the economy in that way, right? Or you have stimulus packages by pumping money into the system. Am I too long? Okay, pumping money into the system, but directing it, ensuring that it's directed towards infrastructure projects or other types of employment creating activities. That is what a central bank that has a mandate around employment creation does. The same can be said about if it has a green mandate. It means that it will use whatever instruments that it has in its toolkit to ensure that it makes adjustments, it creates money or whatever in a way that supports the achievement of that mandate, so that it's not just around inflation targeting. So that's what was meant by that. The question around JETP financing gap. So that was a way I was basically responding to the JETP. So there's 8.5, and maybe I didn't phrase this properly. There's 8.5 billion of committed financing, right? That has been committed to via de-risking strategies. And for that, we say that through this approach, there are a range of risks, right, that whole thing entails. And therefore, in its current package, it's not to be accepted. There is the ambition, right, by these very partners or to have 8.7 billion, 98.7 billion or whatever it is. The question that is, can you raise that money via de-risking? Right? Can you? The answer is no, right? Because of all the reasons I stated, right? You will struggle to do so. You can de-risk and de-risk as much as you want, right? Create avenues of, and which is why, even through this de-risking, the scale of financing historically has not come to the multilateral finance. It hasn't, right? There is this understanding that we are not meeting our climate ambitions as much as we want, but the climate needs are humongous. The question then is that what kind of global financial architecture is in operation that is blocking the mobilization of that financing, number one, and within that, how does that then shape the macroeconomic policy frameworks of countries so that it makes then they become constrained in doing so, and because it hinges on de-risking, you won't meet those you will not reach the scales. But when you, even if you get some money, the costs of that are high. That's the challenge.
Thank you.
There were a range of others, but I don't have time.
We don't have time. I have to be strict.
Sorry.
Sorry.
We'll talk more.
We're already 10 minutes into. Yeah.
It is, but I agree with you on pension funds. They also need a mandate, such as public banks, such as central banks. They all need a mandate and to operate. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Comrade Thomas, 1 minute, strictly.
1 minute. Okay, I will be concise. I agree with everything on central banks. I would emphasize that central banks can play a progressive role in fostering public collaboration with public banks as a matter of policy, but more importantly, getting out of the way in terms of democratic governance of domestic public banks, which they often block, particularly union representation on domestic public banks. In terms of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, a lot of work to do there. I would say, though, a disproportionate amount of attention has been given to the MDBs. They are important, but national and subnational public banks are far bigger, have far more resources, and are far more connected to the local level. And in terms of like the language around just energy transitions, I would point to the public banking movement in the United States. They've done an amazing job of reaching out and connecting the question of public finance and the creation of public banks to marginalized, underserved, and racialized communities, particularly around just energy transitions. And then two final points. The question of pension funds is fraught. I would point towards the Canadian Union of Public Employees that you might want to connect with them. It is a huge issue, and there's a huge problem because the pension funds are profit-oriented. And so they pushed the mandate of the Canada Infrastructure Bank to be private, about mobilizing private finance for profit. There's an important job and work to be done on linking those. Finally, just a note, Sean, in terms of Vietnam, I'm actually doing some work with UNDP and UNCTAD and Vietnamese government on the creation of a new Vietnam Climate Bank, and some interest around that. And there are tensions, and that needs to be explored, and a pro-labor, pro-public vision on that needs to be emphasized, and to make these as a hub of expertise for the public sector by and for trade unions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our session. Thank you very much to the panelists. We couldn't manage. The only enemy here is time. We will, of course, find time during the course of the day and tomorrow to discuss even further. Thank you very much.
It's okay.
They give me the worst thing. Very good, I think, but please understand that we understand that. So can my comrades please take the stand, because come and sit, because the longer you take, the longer we're going to get to lunch. The language that you want to listen in, it will be very clear coming through the headset. Noel, it's your session? Yeah. I think, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Tuana's here. Tuana?
And where's Mahangora? Oh, here he is. Who's Tawana?